Good afternoon. Today we are finishing up that Chapter 8 Civil War. We're looking at that number 9 on the comprehension page, Journey to Freedom. What were some of the difficulties Robert Hickman and his group faced after escaping from Missouri? So we need at least 2 difficulties. When we're looking at what they had to go through, we were talking about how they had to make logs, rafts to travel up the river. Whatever you're doing, stop. And we were talking about how workers on the riverfront didn't want them to get off their boats because they were scared they were going to take their jobs. Okay. Now, let's go to that blue sidebar, Life in Minnesota During the War. That's number 10 on the comprehension page. Lists 3 ways people back home in Minnesota supported the war and the soldiers. So what were people in Minnesota doing to help out? They are going to give us more than 3. You need to write down 3 ways.
Life in Minnesota during the war. The people of Minnesota did all they could to support the soldiers while they were off fighting. Soldiers' aid societies gathered supplies and sent them to the soldiers. These groups also raised money for the families of men who had died in the war, and they provided companionship to the wives and mothers of soldiers. Minnesotans sent thousands of letters and packages to the battlefronts. Charlie Goddard's mother once went so far as to mail him a turkey dinner.
So, let's do the next part. So from there, you should be writing down 3 things that they did.
I am happy to inform you that my box has come. That is something a soldier doesn't get every day. All that was spoiled was the turkey and a few donuts.
Yeah, so when you send a care package, you probably don't want to send perishable food that's going to get rotten, go moldy before it gets to where it's going, right? So sending turkey that's not refrigerated, right? Cooked turkey, you got to keep that in the fridge to keep it good. So he's like, when it got to me, the turkey was spoiled, but the rest was really good. So there are numerous ways that people here in Minnesota were supporting those soldiers, supporting the families back home. I think, isn't there more to it too? But I don't see why I can't get into it. It also says, as the war raged elsewhere, life went on in Minnesota. Babies were born, children went to school, men and women went to work and raised their families. The days were more challenging, however, with so many gone. Life was often especially difficult for farm families when the men went off to war. Wives, sons, and daughters had to take on all sorts of extra work to keep the farms running while the men were away. Another way that they helped support the soldiers, they did the work back here at home, so the soldiers could go off to be, the farmers could go off to be soldiers. So that's just another way. So there's multiple ways that people helped out back in Minnesota. Now we have the Reconstruction Amendments.
The Reconstruction Amendments. Once the Civil War was over, the U.S. government worked to rebuild or reconstruct the nation. One way it did this was to protect the rights of African Americans by having consistent laws throughout the country. As a result, 3 amendments were made to the U.S. Constitution. They are called the Reconstruction Amendments because the period following the war came to be known as Reconstruction. Minnesota's state constitution was ahead of the U.S. Constitution on these issues. Slavery was outlawed in the Minnesota Constitution upon its creation in 1858. 10 years later, the state constitution was amended to allow African American men the right to vote. This was 2 years before a similar amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution.
So Minnesota was kind of ahead of their time. They did it before the United States did it, but the United States did do it, so now all the states have to follow it. So here are the amendments that came about from the Civil War.
The Reconstruction Amendments. Once the Civil War was over, the U.S. government...
All right, let's see if it will open up the next box for me.
Amendment.
There we go.
What it did. What it means. 13th Amendment, 1865. Outlawed slavery in the United States. Slavery could no longer exist in any state or territory. 14th Amendment, 1868. Provided citizenship to all people born in the United States, regardless of race. African Americans now had the same legal rights and protection as other American citizens. 15th Amendment, 1870. Said that the right to vote cannot be denied because of race or skin color. African American men now had the right to vote. The U.S. Constitution did not provide women with the right to vote until 1920.
So different amendments came about because of the Civil War. So that amendment is changing the government document, right? They were changing that Constitution to make it better and stronger. Can we still have amendments made today? Yeah, right? The Constitution is a living and breathing thing. It is not set in stone. We are constantly learning how to be better, to do better, so we can keep adding amendments to make our country the strongest that it can be. That's why we have the ability to amend it, so we can get better. Back when the Constitution was first made, they weren't thinking that slavery was wrong. Now, since the Civil War, they said, whew, we're learning, we're changing and growing, we're making those amendments. There's more amendments that come after the Civil War, and we can still have amendments made in today's world. The last Union soldier.
So what? The last Union soldier. Outside the old train station, known as the Depot, in downtown Duluth, sits a bronze statue. It honors the life of a special Civil War veteran, Albert Wolson. When he died in 1956 at age 109, he was believed to be the Union Army's last surviving veteran. Wolson was a well-known figure in Duluth for many years. He appeared in parades and visited schools, telling students about his time as a Union Army drummer boy. There are people alive today who can remember meeting Albert Wolson and learning about his Civil War experiences. The statue of Wolson is called the Last Union Survivor. It is a replica of a statue on display in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Does your community have a statue or memorial that remembers an important person or event from the past?
Instead of answering that, my challenge to you is the next time you go to Duluth, see if you can find this statue. He is the last Union soldier. He was just a boy, being a drummer boy, so he was young. He was able to survive the Civil War, and he lived to old age. He lived to be 106. So he lived a very long life, and he is seen as the last Civil War person, so Civil War soldier. So there are people, adults, that are alive today that actually met him. He and got to talk to somebody who fought in the Civil War, which is pretty cool. All right, the war ends. This is the last question, but it's a multi-part question. There's that box, Adeline. Well, I was trying to read it on there. I thought it was 109, but it looked like 6, but it's blurry on my board, so it's 109 then. Whatever the book said, it was just blurry when I was looking at it. All right, So the war ends, number 11. In the chart below, you're gonna list 2 effects the Civil War had on the United States, and then 2 effects it had on Minnesota. So these are gonna be worth more than 1 point, because there's multiple things we're putting in here. So on that first side, how was the United States affected by the Civil War? Then how was Minnesota affected? So when we read this first paragraph, it's gonna talk about the United States. Short paragraph. We'll be able to get 2 things out of it right away. Right, that first paragraph is the United States. Then we can see, in contrast, Minnesota, there's gonna be a lot of stuff about Minnesota. You just have to pick 2. There are multiple things that will be on that.
The war ends. The North finally defeated the South in 1865. The war was over, but the nation had paid a terrible price. More than 600,000 soldiers and countless civilians had lost their lives. Many parts of the South were in ruins. In contrast, Minnesota had escaped most of the ravages of the Civil War. The state's economy had flourished. Prices for farm products had risen. Wheat production had doubled. Immigrants had continued to move in, encouraged by a new federal law that granted government land to settlers. Perhaps more importantly, Minnesotans had learned, partly from the horrors of war and the evils of slavery they had experienced, that their lives were firmly connected to those of other Americans. Even so, all was not well in Minnesota. Families were broken and bodies were crippled for life as a result of war. Even more damaging was the conflict that had been raging in the southern part of the state. It happened around the same time Charlie Goddard was fighting at Antietam. This war also inflicted deep wounds that would cause great pain for years to come.
So we hear about 2 negative effects on the United States in that first paragraph. Then, in that middle paragraph about Minnesota, we actually hear positives, right? It didn't always have a negative effect, even though war can be people are dying, right? Down here we hear that families were broken, bodies were crippled for life. So that's a negative. What positives happened to Minnesota because of the war? Who was listening? Robbie?
More people moved to Minnesota.
There were more immigrants moving to Minnesota. We still kept people coming in here. People weren't wanting to go to the states that were fighting, where the battles were actually happening. So those immigrants were moving to Minnesota. What's another positive, Natalie?
The wheat had doubled.
The wheat price had doubled. And we see above that, the state's economy had flourished. Right, because what was the main thing they were doing in Minnesota at this time? Adeline? People were helping the war, but what job did most people in Minnesota have? Those settlers, all those hundreds of settlers coming in, what were they doing, Bridget?
Farming.
Farming. Who needed food during this time? Harper? The soldiers, the army. The government's needing to buy food because those southern states were in the southern northern states, right, where all those battles are happening. They're destroying the land. The battle's happening, the land's getting tore up, they can't farm and grow food. So they're having to get it from the states that don't have the battle happening right then and there. So they're able to buy from Minnesota. So our economy goes up because there's a lot of food being bought from us to be sent to the soldiers.
Is the one that says that 600,000 soldiers died, is that about the United States or Minnesota?
So if we read it, the North finally defeated the South in 1865. The war was over, but the nation had paid a terrible price. More than 600,000 soldiers. So we're not talking Minnesota there, we're talking about the nation. Yes.
But that can be good and bad, right?
Yeah. There were good effects and there were bad effects. So you can have both. at the very bottom, it's talking about another war that happened at the same time. This war actually happened in southern Minnesota. We're gonna learn about it in chapter 9, the U.S. Dakota War of 1862. So we're gonna learn about a small war that really seriously affected southern Minnesota. With that, we are done with our comprehension page. We will be correcting this tomorrow. So if you don't get it finished in class today, you need to take it home and finish it tomorrow. Test is on Thursday.